From the outside, my life looked like the epitome of suburban perfection. My wife, Emily, and I had been married for 18 years. We had 2 incredible children, Ava, 16, sharp and creative, with dreams of becoming an artist, and Jacob, 13, a tech whiz who could dismantle and rebuild a computer faster than I could program the remote. Our lives revolved around school events, sports practices, and weekend movie marathons. I was proud of what we had built together, a stable home, the kind of family I had dreamed of having since my chaotic childhood. Emily was the cornerstone of it all. I met Emily when we were both in college. She was studying marketing, a natural choice for someone as magnetic as she was. I was in finance, methodical and grounded. From the moment we met, Emily was the spark to my steady flame, a whirlwind of energy that drew me in and made me feel alive. When she laughed, the world seemed lighter. When she set her mind to something, nothing could stand in her way. She was my equal, my partner, my everything. At least, that's what I thought. The cracks started appearing in ways I didn't immediately notice, or maybe I didn't want to notice. It began with her becoming unusually secretive about her phone. Emily had always been open, often handing me her phone to show me funny memes or updates from her friends. But now, she would angle it away from me, close apps as I walked by, or take calls in hushed tones in another room. I chalked it up to work stress. She had recently taken on more responsibilities at the marketing firm where she worked, and I figured the increased workload was weighing on her. Then there were the late nights. Emily's job had always required her to work long hours, especially during campaign seasons. But suddenly, she was working late almost every night. She claimed it was due to a new client, some international project that demanded more attention. I didn't question her. Why would I? We had always trusted each other implicitly. Still, doubt crept in. It was small at first, an unwelcome whisper in the back of my mind. But the whispers grew louder when I noticed her wardrobe change. Emily had always been stylish, but she began buying clothes that were flashier, more revealing than her usual taste. She wore perfume every day, even on weekends when we had no plans. And then there was the gym membership, a sudden, intense commitment to fitness that felt out of character for someone who had always joked about preferring yoga pants on the couch to yoga classes. Even with all these changes, I pushed the doubts aside. I wanted to believe in the image of our marriage, in the love we had shared for nearly 2 decades. But my faith began to waver one evening when I was sorting through the mail. Amid the usual stack of bills and advertisements, there was a thin envelope addressed to Emily. The logo of a genealogy testing company caught my eye. I set it on the counter, curious but not suspicious. When Emily came home and saw it, her reaction stunned me. She froze. Her easy smile faltered, and her eyes darted to me, then back to the envelope. "What's this?" I asked, holding it up. "Oh, just something for a friend," she said with a nervous laugh, snatching it out of my hand and shoving it into her purse. Her response was so abrupt, so uncharacteristic, that I couldn't let it go. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the incident played over and over in my mind. Why had she been so defensive? What was in that envelope that she didn't want me to see? That whisper of doubt became a roar. 2 days later, I ordered a DNA testing kit. I told myself it was silly, just a way to put my fears to rest. I didn't believe for a second that anything was wrong. I wasn't Mexican, Emily wasn't Mexican, and our families didn't have any hidden surprises in our genealogies. Or so I thought. The results arrived 2 weeks later. It was a Friday evening, and the kids were out at their friends' houses. Emily was in the shower when I opened the email. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Ava and Jacob's results both showed a significant percentage of Mexican ancestry. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I went over the report again and again, hoping I had misunderstood. But the numbers didn't lie. I sat there in stunned silence, my mind racing. The only explanation was that Ava and Jacob weren't biologically mine. I thought of Emily's boss, Carlos Morales, a tall, suave man with a reputation for charm. I'd met him a few times at company events, and while I had never liked him, I'd never had a reason to distrust Emily around him. Now, every interaction between them replayed in my mind with a sinister undertone. The way she laughed at his jokes, the way his hand lingered too long on her back during a holiday party, the way she mentioned him more and more in casual conversation. I needed proof. I couldn't confront her with just a hunch and a DNA test. So, I hired a private investigator. It felt extreme, even invasive, but I needed answers. I told the investigator everything: the late nights, the secrecy, the odd behavior. He promised to dig into Emily's activities and get to the bottom of it. The wait was agonizing. Every day, I felt like I was walking on a tightrope, pretending everything was normal while my world was unraveling. Emily noticed my tension and asked if I was okay. I brushed her off with excuses about work stress. I couldn't let her see the storm brewing inside me. When the investigator finally called me in for a meeting, I braced myself for the worst. What he showed me was far beyond anything I had imagined. Emily had been having an affair with Carlos for 15 years. He provided hotel receipts, photos of them together, and screenshots of messages that left no room for doubt. The affair had started shortly after Ava was born. Carlos wasn't just her boss, he was the father of my children. The betrayal hit me like a freight train. I didn't know what hurt more, the years of lies, the realization that my children weren't biologically mine, or the knowledge that the woman I had devoted my life to had been unfaithful for nearly our entire marriage. But the final blow came when the investigator revealed that my own family had known. My parents, my siblings, they had all been aware of Emily's affair for years. They hadn't said a word to me. I felt like my entire world had crumbled beneath me, leaving me in a free fall of anger, sorrow, and disbelief. I was reeling, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't let this go unanswered. After I left the investigator's office, I drove aimlessly through town. My thoughts were a hurricane, battering me from every angle. Emily's betrayal wasn't just an affair, it was the slow, methodical erosion of our marriage. For 15 years, she'd built a life on lies, and I'd been the fool who believed her. But the part that cut the deepest was knowing my children, Ava and Jacob, weren't biologically mine. Every memory of their childhood now felt like it belonged to someone else. Yet I couldn't bring myself to see them as anything but mine. When I finally pulled into the driveway, it was late. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the kitchen light. Emily was sitting at the table, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled when I walked in, as though nothing was wrong. For a moment, I considered confronting her right then and there. I wanted to throw the evidence on the table, demand answers, and watch her carefully constructed facade crumble. But I knew I couldn't afford to act on impulse. "Late night?" she asked, her tone casual. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my voice even. "Work's been a lot lately." It wasn't entirely a lie. Work had been demanding, but the weight on my shoulders now wasn't from spreadsheets and quarterly reports. It was the weight of knowing my entire life had been a performance I didn't know I was part of. I poured myself a glass of water, watching Emily from the corner of my eye. She didn't seem to sense anything was wrong, but I noticed how she angled her phone away from me, her fingers swiping quickly before setting it face down on the table. As I went upstairs to our bedroom, I couldn't shake the image of her sitting there, so nonchalant, so composed. How many times had she come home to me after being with him? How many nights had I held her, completely unaware of the lies she carried? That night I barely slept. I stared at the ceiling, the investigator's words replaying in my head. 15 years. The number haunted me. It wasn't just a fling or a brief lapse in judgment, it was a second life she'd lived alongside ours. And Carlos wasn't just anyone. He was her boss, a man with power and influence, someone who could have offered her things I couldn't. But there was more. My family, my own flesh and blood, had known about the affair. How could they look me in the eye, come to our house for dinners, celebrate birthdays, and pretend everything was fine? The betrayal felt like a knife in the back, twisting with every memory of their silence. I trusted them to have my back, and they'd chosen complicity over loyalty. The next morning, I woke early. Emily was still asleep, her face peaceful, as if she hadn't torn my world apart. I resisted the urge to wake her and demand answers. Instead, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, my mind racing with what to do next. One thing was clear: I couldn't let this go. Emily had stolen years from me, but I refused to let her steal my dignity. I needed a plan, a way to confront her that would give me the upper hand. I wasn't going to be another casualty of her deceit. That day, I called the investigator and asked him to gather everything, every photo, every receipt, every message. I wanted the evidence airtight, something she couldn't deny. Then I started planning how I would confront her. It couldn't be impulsive or emotional. It had to be deliberate, calculated. I needed her to see the full extent of what she'd done. But first, I had to address the matter of my family. Their silence was a betrayal I couldn't ignore, and I wasn't going to let it slide. That evening, I called a family meeting under the pretense of discussing an important financial decision. My parents, my two sisters, and my brother all gathered at our house. Emily was conveniently out, attending one of her work events. As we sat around the living room, I kept my tone casual at first, talking about surface-level topics. But then I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and looked each of them in the eye. "I need to ask you all something," I began, my voice steady but sharp. "How long have you known about Emily's affair?" The room fell silent. My mother's hand froze midair, her teacup trembling slightly. My brother shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. My sisters exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "Son, it's not what you think," he started, but I cut him off. "It's exactly what I think. You all knew, didn't you? For years. And you said nothing. Why?" My mother looked down at her lap, her voice barely above a whisper. "We thought we were protecting you. We didn't want to hurt you." "Hurt me?" I snapped, my voice rising. "You didn't want to hurt me, so you let me live a lie for 15 years? You let me raise children I didn't know weren't mine, celebrate anniversaries with a woman who was cheating on me? You stood by and said nothing while she destroyed our family." Tears welled in my mother's eyes, but I didn't feel sympathy. My anger was too raw, too all-consuming. "We thought she'd end it," my sister Julie interjected. "She said it was just a phase, that she loved you." "A phase?" I laughed bitterly. 15 years isn't a phase, it's a life. A life she chose with him while I was here clueless. They had no defense. Their silence spoke volumes, and I realized then that I couldn't count on them for support. If they had betrayed me once, they could do it again. I stood up, my jaw tight. "I don't need your excuses," I said coldly. "I just needed the truth, even if you were too cowardly to give it to me. From now on, I'll handle this on my own." I walked out of the room, leaving them to sit in the uncomfortable silence of their guilt. Back in my office, I opened the investigator's files, sifting through the evidence one more time. Every photo of Emily with Carlos, every message, every receipt, it all painted a picture of a life I hadn't been part of. A life I hadn't consented to. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my self-respect. She had taken enough from me, and I was done letting her control the narrative. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the damning evidence spread across my desk. The next move would be mine, and it would be decisive. I didn't know exactly how far I was willing to go, but one thing was certain: I wasn't going to let Emily, Carlos, or anyone else walk away from this unscathed. The days that followed were a blur of preparation and planning. My emotions swung wildly, from the searing anger at Emily's betrayal, to the hollow ache of realizing my family had been complicit, to the gut-wrenching sorrow for the life I thought we had. But in those quiet moments, when the house was still and I was alone with my thoughts, one thing became clear: I had to confront Emily. And it had to be on my terms. The evidence I'd gathered sat on my desk, neatly organized in folders. Photos of Emily and Carlos, their messages, hotel receipts, all damning, undeniable proof. I spent hours rehearsing the confrontation in my head, going over every possible scenario. I didn't want to explode in anger or break down in tears. I wanted control. I wanted her to feel the weight of her choices, the destruction she'd wrought on our family. One evening, after dinner, I decided the time had come. Ava and Jacob were upstairs, their laughter drifting down the staircase as they argued over a video game. Emily was in the living room, scrolling through her phone as if the world hadn't just shifted beneath our feet. I watched her for a moment, a strange mix of love and resentment stirring in my chest. For 18 years, she'd been my partner, the woman I thought I'd grow old with. And yet here we were, on the edge of a precipice. "Emily," I said, my voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." She looked up, startled. There must have been something in my tone because she immediately set her phone down. "What's wrong?" she asked, her brow furrowing with concern. I gestured toward the dining table. "Let's sit." She hesitated but followed me, her expression cautious. As we sat down, I slid the first folder across the table. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to me. "What's this?" "Open it," I said. Emily's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the cover. Her face went pale as she stared at the photos inside, images of her and Carlos, locked in intimate embraces, entering hotel rooms, laughing over candlelit dinners. She flipped through them silently, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. "I know everything," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. 15 years, Emily. 15 years you've been lying to me, to our family." She closed the folder, her hands resting on top of it as if she could somehow contain the truth. "It's not what you think," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I laughed bitterly. Don't insult me by trying to deny it. I have photos, receipts, messages. I had a private investigator follow you for weeks. This isn't speculation, Emily, it's fact." Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. "Not yet." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for it to go this far." "You never meant for it to go this far?" I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. 15 years, Emily. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. A choice you made every single day." She looked away, her tears spilling over. "I was lonely," she said. "You were always working, always focused on your job. Carlos, he made me feel seen." "And what about Ava and Jacob?" I shot back. "What about them? Did you ever think about what this would do to them?" Emily flinched, her gaze dropping to the table. "I never wanted to hurt them," she said. "Or you. I just—" "Stop," I interrupted, slamming my hand on the table. "Don't you dare make this about me. I was there, Emily. Maybe not every second of every day, but I was there. I supported you. I loved you. And this is how you repay me?" Her tears fell freely now, her hands trembling as she reached for mine. "I'm sorry," she said again. "Please, let's talk about this. We can fix it." I pulled my hands away, the thought of her touch repulsive in that moment. "There's nothing to fix," I said coldly. "You've destroyed everything." Her shoulders sagged, the weight of my words hitting her like a physical blow. For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of her quiet sobs. I stood, unable to look at her any longer. "This isn't just about us," I said, my back to her. "Ava and Jacob, they deserve to know the truth. They deserve to know who their father really is." "No!" Emily's voice was sharp, panicked. "You can't tell them. Please, they're just kids. It'll destroy them." I turned to face her, my jaw clenched. "And what happens when they find out on their own? What happens when they realize their whole lives were built on lies? You think you're protecting them, but all you're doing is delaying the inevitable." Emily shook her head, her hands clutching the edges of the table as if to steady herself. "There are children," she pleaded. "They're yours, no matter what." Her words struck a nerve, the weight of them hitting me harder than I expected. She wasn't entirely wrong. Ava and Jacob were mine in every way that mattered, except biologically. But the betrayal tainted everything, making even the purest love feel stained. I need time, I said finally, my voice cold and distant. Time to figure out how to handle this. Time to decide what happens next. Emily nodded, her face crumpling as fresh tears fell. I'll do whatever you need, she said. I'll end things with Carlos. I held up a hand, cutting her off. I don't want your promises. I want the truth, the whole truth. And I want you out of this house. She stared at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. You're kicking me out? You made your choice, Emily, I said. Now you have to live with it. Without another word, I walked away, leaving her alone at the table with the evidence of her betrayal spread out before her. The days after Emily's confession were a test of endurance. The weight of her betrayal pressed down on me, suffocating and relentless, but I had to keep moving. Ava and Jacob remained oblivious, their laughter and chatter a cruel reminder of the innocence about to be shattered. Every interaction with them was bittersweet, knowing the truth loomed over our family like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Emily stayed in the guest room, a self-imposed exile. She tried to engage me in conversation, to plead her case, but I refused. There was nothing left to say. I told her I needed space to think, to process, and she reluctantly agreed. The tension in the house was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. But I couldn't delay forever. The children had to know the truth. No matter how much I wanted to shield them, they deserved honesty. The idea of confronting them felt insurmountable. How could I explain that their mother's choices had fractured our family? That the man they called Dad wasn't biologically theirs? On Saturday morning, I told Emily it was time. Her face went pale, and she gripped the edge of the counter as though steadying herself. You can't do this, she whispered. They're just kids. They won't understand. They'll understand enough, I said coldly. And they'll hear it from me, not from someone else down the line. Emily didn't fight me, but the defeat in her eyes was clear as she retreated to the guest room. I waited until Ava and Jacob came downstairs for breakfast, the two of them playfully bickering over who got the last waffle. For a fleeting moment, I considered pretending everything was fine, letting them have one more day of normalcy. But the lie felt heavier than ever, and I couldn't carry it any longer. Kids, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. We need to talk. Ava and Jacob exchanged curious glances, their smiles fading as they sensed the seriousness in my tone. They followed me into the living room, sitting side by side on the couch. I sat across from them, my hands clasped tightly to stop them from trembling. What's going on, Dad? Ava asked, her brows knitting together. I took a deep breath, the words catching in my throat. There's something I need to tell you, something about our family. It's going to be hard to hear, but I need you to know the truth. Jacob frowned, leaning forward. What kind of truth? I glanced at Ava, her expression wary but calm. She was always the more composed of the two, the one who took after me in temperament. Jacob, on the other hand, wore his emotions on his sleeve. I knew this would hit him the hardest. You both know how much I love you, I began. That will never change. But I found out something recently, something about your mom and me. Your mom, she's been seeing someone else for a long time. Ava's face went white, her mouth falling open. Jacob's eyes darted between me and the floor, confusion and disbelief written all over his face. What do you mean? Ava asked, her voice trembling. She cheated on you? I nodded, my throat tight. Yes. And it's been going on for a very long time. But there's more to it than that. Jacob's voice was small, barely a whisper. More? I felt the weight of the words I was about to say, knowing they would change everything. The man she's been seeing, he's the one who, he's your biological father. The silence that followed was deafening. Ava stared at me as though I'd just struck her, her lips trembling as tears welled in her eyes. Jacob shook his head, his hands balled into fists. No, he said, his voice rising. That's not true. You're our dad. You've always been our dad. I'm your dad, I said, my voice breaking. In every way that matters, I'm your dad. But biologically, it's him. Ava buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as sobs racked her body. Jacob stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. Why are you telling us this? He shouted. Why couldn't you just leave it alone? I reached for him, but he pulled away, his tears spilling over as he ran upstairs. The sound of his door slamming echoed through the house, each vibration like a hammer to my chest. Ava wiped her eyes, looking at me with a mix of heartbreak and anger. Why did you wait until now to tell us? Did you know the whole time? No, I said quickly. I just found out. I didn't want to keep it from you because I thought you deserved to know the truth. She shook her head, her voice raw. I don't know if I wanted to know. She stood, walking away before I could say another word. I watched her go, the weight of my decision settling heavily on me. Had I done the right thing? Was there ever a right way to tell your children that their lives weren't what they thought they were? Later that evening, Emily found me in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn. How did it go? She asked hesitantly. They know, I said simply. And now they hate me. They don't hate you, she said, though her tone lacked conviction. They just need time. Time? I snapped, turning to face her. Time won't fix this, Emily. You broke us. You did this. And now I have to clean up the mess. She flinched at my words, tears brimming in her eyes. I never wanted this to happen. But it did, I said, my voice hard. And now we all have to live with it. That night, the house was unbearably quiet. Ava and Jacob stayed in their rooms, refusing to come down for dinner. Emily retreated to the guest room, leaving me alone in the living room with my thoughts. I stared at the photo on the mantel, a picture of all four of us at the beach last summer, laughing as the sun set behind us. It felt like a lifetime ago, a relic from a life that no longer existed. As I sat there, I realized that this was only the beginning. The truth was out, but the fallout was far from over. The next steps would define not only my relationship with Ava and Jacob but also the kind of man I wanted to be moving forward. One thing was certain, I couldn't let Emily and Carlos destroy everything I had left. The fallout of the revelation weighed heavily on me, but I knew I couldn't let it paralyze me. Emily's betrayal was only half the story. The man who had intruded on my life for over a decade, who had fathered my children and still maintained his place as her boss, needed to face the consequences of his actions. Carlos Morales wasn't just some faceless adversary. He was a predator who had walked into my home, shaken my hand, and smiled in my face while tearing apart my family behind my back. The next morning, I called the private investigator. I want everything you have on Carlos, I told him. Every transaction, every detail. I need to know who I'm dealing with. The investigator, a grizzled man named Ray, didn't ask questions. I've got enough to ruin him, but I'll dig deeper. Give me a couple of days. The wait was agonizing. Every hour felt like a lifetime as I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy at home. Ava and Jacob were distant, avoiding me and retreating into their own worlds. Emily hovered like a ghost, her guilt evident in every hesitant glance. I felt like a stranger in my own house, but I had no time to dwell on it. My focus was on Carlos. When Ray called 3 days later, his tone was grim. We need to meet. You're going to want to see this. I met him at a small cafe on the edge of town, far enough away to ensure privacy. Ray slid a thick envelope across the table. Carlos isn't just a cheating boss, he said. He's dirty, really dirty. Inside the envelope were documents detailing Carlos's business dealings. Fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion were just the tip of the iceberg. He had used his position at the company to funnel money into offshore accounts, masking his illegal activities behind a veneer of success. There were photos of him meeting with dubious individuals and receipts for extravagant purchases that couldn't be justified by his reported income. He's got skeletons in his closet that could bury him, Ray said. But there's more. He's been involved with other women at the company. Emily wasn't the first, and she probably won't be the last. The revelation made my blood boil. Carlos hadn't just destroyed my family, he had likely done the same to others. He was a manipulator, a man who thrived on control and deceit. But now, I had something he couldn't escape, evidence. "What do you want to do?" Ray asked. I stared at the pile of incriminating documents, my mind racing. I had the power to ruin Carlos's career, his reputation, his entire life. But I wanted more than that. I wanted him to face me, to see the man whose life he had invaded and understand the consequences of his actions. "I want to confront him," I said finally. "But I want to do it on my terms." Ray nodded. "Then you'll need to be strategic. Men like Carlos don't back down easily." 2 days later, I found myself standing outside Carlos's office building. I'd taken the day off work, telling Emily to keep the kids at home. She looked wary, as though sensing I was about to do something drastic. I didn't bother to explain. This wasn't her battle anymore. Carlos's receptionist was startled when I walked in, but I didn't give her a chance to stop me. I pushed open the door to his corner office, finding him seated at his desk, typing on his laptop. He looked up, surprised, but quickly masked it with a confident smile. "Ah, Michael," he said, leaning back in his chair. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" I shut the door behind me, locking it with a deliberate click. His smile faltered slightly. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold. Carlos gestured to the chair opposite him. "Of course. Have a seat." I ignored the offer, stepping closer to his desk. "I know everything, Carlos. About you and Emily. About Ava and Jacob. About what you've done." He stiffened, his expression darkening. "I don't know what you're talking about." I pulled the envelope from my bag, tossing it onto the desk. "Don't insult me. It's all in there, your affair, your illegal dealings, every dirty secret you've tried to hide." Carlos's face blanched as he opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the contents. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across his features. "This is absurd," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "You can't prove any of this." "I don't need to prove it," I said. "Not to you, anyway. I've already made copies. The board of directors will have it by the end of the day. And if that doesn't sink you, the authorities will." Carlos stood abruptly, his fists clenched. "You don't want to do this, Michael. You have no idea who you're dealing with." I took a step closer, meeting his gaze with cold determination. "No, Carlos. You have no idea who you're dealing with. You thought you could walk into my life, take my wife, father my children, and walk away unscathed. But you're wrong. This ends now." For a moment, we stood there, the tension crackling between us. Then Carlos's shoulders sagged, and he sank back into his chair. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "I want you out of our lives," I said. "You resign from the company. You stop contacting Emily. And you never, ever go near Ava or Jacob again. If you so much as look in their direction, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life behind bars." Carlos stared at me, his jaw tightening. "And if I don't? Then I'll burn your world to the ground." He exhaled sharply, his bravado crumbling under the weight of my words. "Fine," he said reluctantly. "I'll resign. I'll leave them alone." "Good," I said, turning to leave. At the door, I paused, looking back at him. "Remember this, Carlos. Men like you always think you're untouchable. But there's always someone willing to fight back. This time, it's me." I walked out without looking back, my heart pounding. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control, of purpose. The battle wasn't over, but I'd taken the first step. Carlos Morales would no longer cast his shadow over my family. Confronting Carlos gave me a fleeting sense of victory, but it didn't erase the damage he and Emily had caused. The weight of betrayal still pressed on my chest, and the fractures in my family were painfully visible. Ava and Jacob were distant, their usual laughter replaced by silence, or the dull hum of their devices. Emily kept to herself, a shadow of the confident woman I once knew. And me, I was struggling to find the man I used to be before my world fell apart. I spent the next few days navigating a delicate balance between rebuilding trust with my kids and planning the next steps in my life. One thing was clear: I couldn't stay in the same house as Emily any longer. Her presence was a constant reminder of what she'd done, and while I still cared about her well-being on some level, I knew I had to prioritize my own. One evening, I called Ava and Jacob into the living room. Emily lingered in the hallway, watching silently, her face etched with worry. I ignored her, focusing on my kids as they sat across from me, their expressions guarded. "We need to talk about what's next," I began, my tone calm but firm. "Things are going to change around here. I want to make sure you're both okay with how we move forward." Ava crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means I'm filing for divorce," I said, the words heavy in the air. "Your mom and I, we can't fix this. But that doesn't change how much I love you both." Jacob's eyes widened, and he looked at me as if I'd just confirmed his worst fears. "So what? You're leaving us?" he asked, his voice breaking. "No," I said quickly, leaning forward. "I'm not leaving you. I'm not going anywhere. But I can't stay in this house with your mom. It's not healthy for any of us." Ava's gaze flicked to Emily, who was still standing in the shadows. "What about her?" she asked coldly. Emily stepped into the room then, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this as easy as possible for you," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you, and I'm so sorry. I'll move out if that's what's best." Her words were met with silence. Ava and Jacob exchanged glances, their emotions too complex for their young faces to mask. I felt a pang of guilt for putting them in this position, but I knew there was no way around it. "I'll be staying in the house for now," I said. "But your mom and I will work out the details. The most important thing is that you both know none of this is your fault. None of it." Jacob's voice was barely audible. "Are we still a family?" The question cut deep, and I struggled to keep my composure. "We're always a family," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It might look different, but we're still a family. I promise." After the conversation, Ava retreated to her room, her walls firmly up. Jacob stayed in the living room, his eyes glued to the TV, but I could tell he wasn't really watching. Emily disappeared into the guest room, and I sat in silence, the enormity of the situation pressing down on me. The next morning, I met with my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Claire who had come highly recommended. I laid everything out: the affair, the DNA results, the evidence of Carlos's involvement. Claire listened carefully, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "You have a strong case," she said. "The infidelity alone gives you grounds for divorce, and the paternity issue complicates things, but it also strengthens your position." "What about custody?" I asked. "The kids aren't biologically mine, but I've raised them their whole lives." Claire nodded. "Courts prioritize the best interests of the children. The biological connection matters, but so does the emotional bond. Given the circumstances, I think you have a good chance of securing joint custody, maybe even primary custody if you can prove Emily's actions were detrimental." I felt a flicker of hope. "What about Carlos? Can we keep him out of their lives?" "That depends on Emily," Claire said. "If she tries to involve him, we can argue against it. But ultimately, it'll be up to the court to decide." The thought of Carlos having any role in Ava and Jacob's lives made my stomach churn, but I trusted Claire to fight for us. As I left her office, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore, I was fighting for my kids. Back at home, Emily was packing her belongings into boxes. She moved slowly, her shoulders slumped as she carried items from room to room. I watched her for a moment, conflicted. Part of me wanted to yell, to demand why she had done this to us. But another part of me, one I wasn't ready to face, still felt a pang of sadness for what we had lost. "I'll be out by the weekend," she said when she noticed me standing in the doorway. "I found a place nearby." "Good," I said simply. She hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the box. Do you hate me? I didn't answer right away. The question felt too big, too loaded. Finally I said, I don't know. I hate what you've done. But I don't know if I can hate you. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She nodded and went back to packing, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That weekend, Emily moved out. Ava and Jacob watched from the window as the moving truck pulled away, their expressions unreadable. I didn't know what they were thinking, but I knew this moment would stay with them forever. As the dust settled, I realized that rebuilding my life wouldn't be a single event. It would be a process, a series of small steps forward and backward. But I was ready to start. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I would fight for my children, for their happiness, and for the chance to create something new out of the wreckage. With Emily gone, the house felt emptier than I expected. The spaces she once occupied seemed larger, echoing with the silence of absence. But it wasn't just her absence. It was the absence of the life I thought we had, the dream that had been shattered beyond repair. Yet, amidst the grief and uncertainty, I felt a flicker of relief. For the first time in weeks, there was clarity. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but at least it was mine to walk. Ava and Jacob, however, were struggling. They moved through the house like ghosts, avoiding me and each other. Ava buried herself in her sketchbooks, creating dark, chaotic drawings that mirrored her emotions. Jacob retreated to his computer, his headphones acting as a barrier between him and the world. I tried to connect with them, but every attempt was met with resistance. A curt nod from Ava, a distracted "yeah" from Jacob. One evening, as I prepared dinner, I decided to confront the distance head-on. Setting 3 plates on the table, I called out, "Dinner's ready!" For a moment, I thought they wouldn't come. But eventually Ava shuffled in, followed by Jacob, both moving with the reluctance of teenagers forced to endure family time. They sat without a word, picking at their food. I cleared my throat, trying to break the tension. "How was school?" "Fine," Ava said, not looking up. "Same," Jacob mumbled. The silence that followed was unbearable. Finally, I set down my fork and leaned forward. "Look, I know things have been hard lately. I know you're upset, at me, at your mom, at everything. And you have every right to be." Ava's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. "Do we? Do we have the right to be upset, or are you just saying that so we'll stop acting like this?" Her words stung, but I held my ground. "You do. And I don't expect you to be okay with any of this right now. But I want you to know that I'm here. Whatever you're feeling, whatever you need, I'm here." Jacob finally looked at me, his face filled with frustration. "You're here now, but where were you before? How did you not know? How did you not see what she was doing?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had asked myself those same questions over and over, lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling. "I don't have a good answer for that," I admitted. "I should have seen it. I should have asked more questions. But I didn't, and I'm sorry. I let you down, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you." Jacob's eyes softened slightly, but he didn't respond. Ava, however, wasn't ready to let me off the hook. "You and Mom broke everything," she said, her voice trembling. "You ruined our family." I wanted to argue, to tell her that it wasn't my fault. But I knew that wouldn't help. Instead, I said, "I know it feels that way. And I'm sorry for what this has done to you. But we're still a family. It'll just look different." Ava shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She pushed her plate away and stood. "It's not the same," she said before storming upstairs. Jacob stared at his sister's retreating figure, then back at me. "She's right," he said quietly. "It's not the same." He followed Ava, leaving me alone at the table. The weight of their pain was crushing, but I knew I couldn't give up. Rebuilding their trust would take time, patience, and unwavering love. The next day, I met with Claire to finalize the divorce proceedings. Emily had agreed to my terms, joint custody of Ava and Jacob, with primary residence at my house. Carlos would have no contact with them, something Emily had reluctantly accepted after realizing how much damage his involvement could do in court. "We'll file the paperwork this afternoon," Claire said, handing me the finalized documents. "Once it's done, you'll have a fresh start." A fresh start. The words sounded hopeful, but the reality felt far more complicated. Still, it was a step forward, and I clung to that. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into creating a new routine for Ava, Jacob, and me. I made an effort to be present, really present. I drove them to school, attended Jacob's robotics competitions, and spent hours watching Ava sketch, even when she refused to speak. It was slow, painstaking work, but I could feel the ice between us beginning to thaw. One evening, I found Ava sitting at the kitchen table, her sketchbook open in front of her. She didn't look up as I approached, but she didn't leave, either, a small victory. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat across from her, watching as she worked. "That's beautiful," I said after a while, gesturing to the page. She had drawn a surreal cityscape, the buildings twisting and bending like something out of a dream. "Thanks," she said quietly, her pencil pausing for a moment. We sat in silence for a while, the air between us less charged than it had been in weeks. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes searching mine. "Do you think we'll ever feel normal again?" Her question caught me off guard, but I answered honestly. "I don't know if it'll ever be the same kind of normal," I said. "But I think we can find a new one. It'll take time, but we'll get there." She nodded, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jacob was harder to reach. He spent most of his time in his room, headphones on, lost in his own world. But one night, I knocked on his door and asked if he wanted to play video games. To my surprise, he agreed. For the next hour, we played, the tension easing as we laughed and yelled at the screen. Afterward, as he put the controller down, he said, "I miss how things used to be." "I do too," I said. "But I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." He nodded, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in days. "Okay." It was a small step, but it felt monumental. As I sat in the quiet house that night, I realized the path to healing would be long and winding. But for the first time in a while, I felt a sense of hope. My family was fractured, but it wasn't broken beyond repair. Piece by piece, we would rebuild. It had been months since Emily moved out, months since the truth came crashing down on us. The pieces of our lives were slowly beginning to fall into place, though not in the way I had imagined. The kids were still grappling with the fallout, and so was I. But we were learning, little by little, how to function in this new reality. Just when I thought things were settling, life threw us a curveball, one I never saw coming. One Friday evening, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Ava was upstairs, likely sketching or scrolling through her phone, while Jacob tinkered with one of his robotics projects in the living room. The doorbell rang, its chime cutting through the stillness of the house. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door. Standing there was a woman I didn't recognize. She was tall, impeccably dressed, with sharp features and a determined expression. "Michael, right?" she asked. I hesitated, my grip tightening on the doorframe. "Yes. Can I help you?" "My name is Sofia Morales," she said. The name hit me like a slap to the face. Carlos's wife. I stared at her, stunned. "What do you want?" "May I come in?" she asked, glancing over my shoulder. "It's about Carlos. And your family?" Every instinct told me to slam the door, but curiosity won out. I stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. She walked in, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Jacob poked his head out of the living room, his eyes wide, before I motioned for him to stay put. We sat in the kitchen, a strange silence hanging between us. Finally, Sophia spoke. "I know what my husband has done, to you, to your family, and to mine." I folded my arms, leaning against the counter. "Why are you here? To apologize for him?" "No," she said firmly. "I'm here because I want to end this once and for all. Her words caught me off guard. What do you mean? She pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. Carlos has been lying to everyone, me, you, Emily. He's not just a cheater, he's a criminal. And I have the proof. I opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. Financial records, incriminating emails, photographs, everything that confirmed what the investigator had already found, and more. Sophia's evidence painted an even darker picture of Carlos. He wasn't just laundering money, he was tied to shady dealings with dangerous people. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice cold. I want to ensure he's held accountable, Sophia said. Not just for what he's done to me, but for what he's done to you and your kids. You deserve justice. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I'd thought confronting Carlos would be the end of it, but now I saw a new opportunity, a chance to ensure he couldn't harm anyone else. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Sophia and I worked together, pooling our evidence and presenting it to the authorities. It wasn't long before Carlos was under investigation, his empire unraveling piece by piece. News of his corruption spread like wildfire, and his resignation from the company became inevitable. Watching him fall was satisfying, but it didn't erase the damage he had done. Through it all, Emily stayed silent. She seemed resigned, as though she knew she was caught in the wake of a storm she had helped create. When Carlos was finally arrested, she called me, her voice trembling. Do the kids know? She asked. Not yet, I replied. But they'll find out eventually. They deserve to know the truth. Emily sighed, the sound heavy with regret. I'm sorry, Michael. For all of it. Her apology felt hollow, but I didn't have the energy to argue. It's done now, I said. Let's just focus on moving forward. Life began to take on a new rhythm. Ava started opening up more, her sketches becoming less chaotic and dark. She even showed me one of her latest pieces, a family portrait, imperfect but hopeful. Jacob began spending more time with me in the evenings, teaching me about his robotics projects and laughing at my failed attempts to keep up. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Jacob turned to me. You're still my dad, he said, his voice quiet but firm. No matter what. I blinked back tears, pulling him into a hug. And you'll always be my son, I said. Always. Ava, sitting on the other side of the couch, glanced over. I guess that makes us okay, she said with a small smile. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Months later, as the dust settled, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. My marriage was over, my trust had been shattered, and the life I'd known was gone. But I had gained something I hadn't expected, a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just surviving, I was rebuilding. For Ava, for Jacob, and for myself. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, I sat on the back porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. Ava and Jacob joined me, their laughter carrying on the breeze. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The betrayal had been devastating, but it hadn't destroyed me. If anything, it had shown me what truly mattered, the bond once shared with my kids, the strength I had within me, and the resilience of a family determined to heal.